demonstrating respect to the individuals whose remains were discovered in 1994 with the construction of the contest building. At this point in time, I'm going to turn the program over to Don Edwards, who is going to walk us through our agenda for today, and also give us a recap of the prior two community consultations. Don is the principal with Justice and Sustainability Associates. They have worked extensively in the U.S. and in similar projects and really engaging the community around facilitation processes, mediation, and so we're very pleased to have Don with us in JSA today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see some faces that I've seen before, and I want to thank everybody for being here. We're expecting more people to join us, so I'll say right off the bat that there may come a point, depending on our numbers, where we'll consolidate some of these tables, but we're going to start off being hopeful that they'll fill in around those who are here. So this is community consultation number 3 for the East Marshall Street Well Project. And I want to spend a little time bringing you both up to date and telling you what we're going to do today. So in consultation number 1, which took place now about 30 days ago, we were able to get introduced to the world of history and medical education. Jordan Posse, who's an archivist at Virginia Commonwealth University, has done a fair amount of investigation, kind of set the framework for understanding how the remains got into the realm, where they came from. She also established a kind of framework for this grave robbing process that really was at the core of providing cadavers for medical education in the 19th century. She was followed in the second consultation by Greg Kimball from the Library of Virginia, and he focused his presentation on helping us understand the day-to-day lives and reality of African Americans living in 19th century Richmond. Now, we did that in order to establish a framework for the consultations, educational presentations that you'll hear today. We are going to basically now talk more about the science, about the actual remains, and talk about how to think and give you a lens through which to understand more about the individuals and the remains that came out of the well. And so we hope that you will, if you go to our website, be able to follow the evolution. We will have those interruptions during the day, and that's just part of us being able to use this great facility, so we'll just bear with that. But we want to set the context, so hopefully not only what you hear today, but if you go back and follow the presentations, what we've been trying to do is build an understanding amongst the consultations participants. And we'll talk more about why we wanted to build that understanding, but that's kind of what we have been doing thus far. That's where you're entering, or if you've been here in the previous consultations, that's what hopefully you took away. Now I want to show you a Wordle. This is the Wordle from the first consultation. And I'm not sure you can see the words as well, but what we tried to do is give you a graphic representation of the input that we got. And you see, the way the Wordle works, the words that were most often used are larger. And so you begin to see some of where people's inputs clumped. And now let's look at the Wordle for the second consultation. And you see some similarities. By the end of this process, we'll combine all the Wordles, which will be able to kind of graphically communicate what people have been thinking about and where we've gotten input. But there are some continuities that you may see between Wordle 1 and Wordle 2. And I suspect by the time we're through Wordle 4, there will be some themes that have emerged. And of course, that's part of what we wanted to do. Let's look at our next slide. One of the things that we are very happy with is the fact that you have stayed with this process. And we'd like to encourage you to stay with it because it is a process. It is not an event. And we say that because it also represents an opportunity for many people to influence bridging the past to the present and to the future. And we want to encourage you to spread the word about this process. It's a slightly different process, and I'll talk more about that as we go on, but we have tried to really make it possible for people to participate in a number of different ways. Folks, we encourage you to tweet out. We've encouraged folks to tweet about the project. We've asked folks to go to our YouTube channel, to go to our Facebook page and like the page, and just make it possible for more and more people to know about this project and hopefully participate in it. So that's kind of setting the stage. So now I want to talk to you about what we're actually going to do today, because this is why you're all here. This is the work. So these are our project's objectives, and you have this material in your packets. And essentially, the idea here is that we will be able to use this process to make recommendations, and hopefully informed recommendations, about the eventual memorialization, study, even reburial of the human remains that were found in the well. And so what we have designed, let's go to the next slide, is an agenda that, again, as with the first two consultations, begins with an educational presentation to set the framework for the tasks we're going to ask you to do today. And then, of course, we're going to lead you through a series of 2 tasks that you will speak amongst yourselves and end up giving us further input. And from the standpoint of our design, it basically has these ingredients: a presentation, table discussions, which is where the tasks will be undertaken, using iPads and being assisted by table facilitators. And if the table facilitators will hold up their hands so everybody knows who you are. These are folks who have volunteered to help us manage the discussions at the table, to keep them on track and on schedule. And they are assisted by scribes. And the scribes will you hold up your hands. So let's first of all thank them for their willingness to help us. But secondly, they're really the resources for 2 things. One, making sure that the discussion takes place at each table in a productive way on schedule. And secondly, that the information, the input that you give gets sent to our ideas team, which is going to be collating the information in real time. And then we get to a point in the agenda where we actually feed back to you what you as a room have been saying and suggesting in the way of your guidance. And that's basically the process. We'll do that 2 times. We have 2 tasks that we're going to ask you to do, and this is the process that we'll follow. And then we'll end with an evaluation, talk a little bit about our next steps. So that's the basic framework. The things that we want you to do is follow the guidance that you get from your table facilitators or from me. And as much as possible, we think you'll have enough time to have a fairly rounded discussion, and then we'll be able to collate all of that and feed it back to you. There are some elements of this that are perhaps different from other meetings you've gone through. So I want to talk about, I just want to mention, I don't think the need is there to talk about it, but these are our ground rules. We expect that you all have come here because you have views, and we want you to share those views. We also want everybody's views to be given a respectful hearing. So we encourage you to approach the task as both sharing your views and giving your input, but also allowing others to do that as well. We want you to, of course, stay focused in the room, so please turn off your cell phones or at least put them on vibrate. And if possible, we encourage you to just stay focused in the table's discussion so that we are able to really get the most out of you for the time that you're here. One of the things that I will mention is we use these sessions for the work that we're here to do. So if there are other issues, other areas of interest, we ask you to really leave those outside the room. So we don't put things in the middle of the room and in the middle of the table that are really best dealt with outside the room. So that kind of sets the stage. I don't know if you have any questions. We've got restrooms out to the left. We've got refreshments. We don't take a break. We're just going to run through it, and we commit to finishing by noon, which is what we advertised, and that's one of our promises. So if there are no other questions, the first speaker is Dr. Tal Simmons. She is going to come up. She'll be followed by Dr. Michael Blakey. After that, I'll come back up and give you the first task, and then we'll get to work. Is all right? Okay. Any questions about the ground rules or anything else? Everybody all right with the ground rules? Anybody not all right? Okay. Thank you.
That was the bell of introduction, I guess. This was clearly designed for somebody slightly taller than myself, so. I just wanted, before I began, to thank you. I knew it had to come from somewhere down further, but I wanted to take a minute to introduce myself in the context of why I've been asked to speak with you today. I am the new chair of the Department of Forensic Sciences at VCU, but I come from a long-term background in sort of post-conflict investigations around the world, working with mass graves and people who were killed in terms of violations of international humanitarian law. I've worked in Bosnia and Kosovo, in Guatemala, in Cyprus and Sri Lanka, and consulted in a few other places besides. I've worked with Physicians for Human Rights, the International Red Cross, International Commission on Missing Persons, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other kinds of non-government organizations in helping families to resolve the issues of their missing. So that's the context that I'm coming to you to speak about today in connection with the East Marshall Street Well Project. And really what I'm doing is responding to questions that I think were posed by you, passed along to me by Quincy Birdsong, and I'll attempt to address those today. Hang on, it's not advancing, there we go. I know that Dr. Blakey is going to spend considerable more time than I am in going through the findings of the anthropological examination of the skeletons from the well project, but I wanted to begin with just a very brief summary of what was found. The remains in the well obviously were commingled. They were not burials. These were remains of individuals from dissections, surgical procedures on deceased individuals, and amputations and things like that. We know from the findings of the initial report that there were 44 adults and 9 children. And of those, the majority are of African ancestry, although there are a couple that were identified as being of European ancestry. And of course, it leaves quite a few there that we don't know anything about. What the anthropologists originally tried to do was to pair up bones from this assemblage to try to create individuals out of this mass of bones. And they did this by what's called pair matching, looking at size and shape and seeing if they could put things together, sometimes by articulations. There are certain bones that fit very tightly together, and so they were able to use that to put things together. And I think that probably the best news for all of us in terms of any future work that would be done, both anthropologically and in terms of DNA, which I'll start talking about in a moment, is that from my discussions with the anthropologists at the Smithsonian who did these exams, the bone itself is in very, very good condition. What do we know about the people there and what kinds of research have already been done? Well, the original report talked about diseases that these individuals suffered from. And we know that there were some fairly widespread disease processes. There were signs of chronic stress, for example, periostitis on the tibia, on the shin bone. This is something that is technically associated with chronic stress, whether it's malnutrition or disease or, we don't know specifically. And the older individuals suffered from osteoporosis or bone mass loss, which is still very common today. There were other individuals in this collection of bones who suffered from tuberculosis. One suffered from syphilis, and one had a widespread cancer. And there were also degenerative bone conditions, and these were probably the most common conditions that were found among these individuals. They had arthritis, just like we do today, in the vertebra, in the shoulder, the hip, the wrist, the ankle, and the knee, the same sites we suffer from today. And again, they also had something we don't see perhaps as often, and these are physical stresses that had changes that took place in their muscle attachments to their bone areas, mostly in their elbows and hips, and that tends to be associated with heavy lifting and carrying of objects. They also suffered from trauma. Antemortem fractures, things that happened to them while they were alive, were present in 5 of the crania. That's the part of the head without the lower jaw, and 6 of their other bones, okay? Generally, they're long limb bones. The ones in the cranium were mostly their nasal bones, their noses, their frontal bones, forehead area. That's generally indicative of interpersonal violence, people being struck, people being in a fight, and also limb fractures, which are usually more indicative of accidents. There were a few indications of perimortem injuries, or injuries that occurred right around the time of death that wouldn't heal, okay, or were not healed yet. Those were only present or discernible in 4 individuals. They were all over the age of 35 years, 3 males, 1 female, 2 of African ancestry, 1 of European ancestry, and 1 unknown. And they included all the types of trauma that we do tend to see as perimortem injuries, namely blunt force trauma, sharp force trauma, and projectile trauma, again, all signs of interpersonal violence. There was a lot of evidence of very little evidence of medical treatment. There was only 1 evidence of surgical intervention, in other words, while an individual was living. And there were lots of evidence of cut marks from autopsy and dissection and training in surgery for amputation. Basically, this was found in about 34 of the skull bones, and 42 of the other bones of the body had intentional sectioning or cutting in half. And this was biased by age and sex, which was kind of interesting. The females had more of their heads sectioned in terms of a medical school type dissection or an autopsy more than males. Males had their long bones cut more often than females did. Younger individuals more often had their heads cut for medical dissection or autopsy, and more of the older adults were cut in the long bones. Okay, I'm going to leave the rest of that discussion to Dr. Blakey, who is much more of a bioarchaeologist and biological anthropologist than I am and knows more about this time period and these bodies. I'm a forensic anthropologist, okay? So I deal with victims of homicide, I deal with individuals who have been found and are unidentifiable. And that's where my area of expertise really lies. So one of the questions that was asked was, what are the options now that are related to DNA testing? And I'll spend the rest of my time talking about that. Basically, the first thing that you need to know is that if the community decides that it is interested in undertaking DNA testing on these remains, that this is a destructive process. All right, samples would have to be cut from the bones that would undergo the DNA testing. Now, they're fairly small. These days, they're getting smaller because the technology is better, but it is a destructive process to some extent, and about a 5-gram sample is generally needed. All right, and this can be cut out with a saw, a type of a surgical saw, and taken from each bone that it would be worthwhile to do this from. And that generally excludes bones that are very spongy in their nature. So no ribs, no vertebra, all right? And the smaller bones of the hands and feet would not be used for this. So what it might allow us to accomplish, if that's the direction the community wanted to go, would be to reassemble individual bodies. Okay, more so than perhaps what was able to be accomplished by the pair matching and the articulations that were done by the original anthropologists who looked at this collection. Again, my recommendation to the community would be a particular technique that's involved in bone-to-bone matching that was developed at the International Commission of Missing Persons in Bosnia. And this is called a miniplex. All right, it uses fewer markers than we would normally use in a forensic case to match a deceased individual to their living family, because we're not doing that at this stage. This would simply be matching legs to arms to heads or whatever that they were unable to accomplish initially because those connections were not there. All right. So with this technique, you can match bone to bone and assemble an entire individual, okay, or as much of that individual as might be there. And that might be something that would be very worthwhile. Okay? The second question was, is there any way to connect these bodies to the graves or families? Okay? And can that testing be done to identify family members themselves? So the second goal would be associating the bodies in the well to people who are living today in the greater Richmond community. What would that require? Well, basically, we'd have to identify people within the community who think they might have a connection to the individuals recovered from that well. We'd have to collect DNA by just doing a cheek swab, a buccal swab, from all the individuals in the community, as many family members of those individuals as possible, and then they could undertake matching of the familial DNA to the DNA from the bones. So can we connect this? Well, basically there are several challenges to doing this. First of all, there would have to be decisions made about what type of DNA analysis to do, and there are many options. Mitochondrial DNA connects through the maternal lineage, all right? And that means that everyone, male and female, inherits their mother's mitochondrial DNA. So it's a good way to trace families. Y chromosome DNA, if you have a continuous male linkage, might work. Nuclear DNA works best, but that requires many family members of a single individual in order to do that match, given the time frame that's involved between today and those individuals in the well. And then there are some new techniques being developed actually at VCU by my colleagues that have to do with RNA. And the only reason I'm suggesting this is that they're very promising and that there is a lot more RNA to be recovered from individual cells than there is DNA. So that might work. Basically, to sum up, what this does is to give people a chance to make these bodies whole again by reassociating bones into complete individuals. It might allow the community to both identify these individuals as being a member of the family and to better identify with them as community members. And then that might help in deciding how you wish to memorialize these individuals, as well as those who we may not be able to reassociate or to identify in other ways. The other thing I wanted to suggest that might help the community relate better to these individuals is that there are newer techniques of facial reconstruction. And from what I understand, there are several complete, not very many, crania with mandibles associated. These could be CT scanned, and potentially faces could be rebuilt on them through new types of software and techniques that might again give a face to the people who were in the well. Again, all of this requires money, always. But there are ways to write grants to take care of that funding. One important thing that I learned is that the Smithsonian is more than happy to return these remains to VCU or to whatever group would undertake this analysis. They don't see that as an issue at all. And we as a Department of Forensic Science would certainly be interested in partnering with the East Marshall Street Well Project if that's desirable. So thanks very much for inviting me to speak with you today. And I'm sure Dr. Blakey.
Good morning. I'm Michael Blakey, and I'm very glad that I suggested that we invite one of VCU's forensic geneticists. And actually, my initial inspiration for that is that I had advised a group here about the commingled remains that had the idea of reassembling remains, reassembling individuals. And I basically was proceeding from the standpoint of our usual problems of commingled remains and said, I don't think it's likely that you'd be able to do that. And at the same time, I think I advised something on genetics that as opposed to trying to identify African origins and that sort of thing, which is very difficult and at times dubious, that what is reliable in forensics is the identification of an individual, which, as I thought afterwards, means that DNA might very well be used to reassemble an individual. So I appreciate the correction for that. I knew it was coming. And you know, this is what we do. We try to learn as we go. Professor Simmons has given, I think, quite a good overview of much of the bioarchaeological aspects that I will refer to. I'll fill in some gaps that I think may be important on the report on the artifacts and commingled skeletal remains found, as the title says, from a well on the Medical College of Virginia campus, the 2012 report of Doug Owsley and Dr. Rueld Hyde. I've been asked to review this, and let me position myself, hopefully fairly, in this review. When I wrote the annual review in anthropology on the bioarchaeology of the African diaspora, the journal Annual Review requested me not to try and be general and neutral, but to express what my position was, where I stood in the way that I looked at the history and the scope of that area of study. And I think many scholars are coming to this understanding that we are not positioned in a neutral way, that absolute objectivity is not something that human beings are capable of, but we can be fair and honest about where we stand and how we look at the data. And so I wrote that review from the standpoint of the New York African Burial Ground Project, its particular way of approaching and analyzing things, and then looking back on the history of that field from there. So I feel it's only fair as I examine Dr. Owsley's report to say something about my relationship to the approaches that Dr. Owsley and Jantz of the University of Tennessee, both of them were students of Bill Bass at Tennessee, my relationship to them, in a sense, in their perspectives. I went to graduate school at UMass Amherst, where we were in quite absolute opposition to the kind of analysis being done at Tennessee. And Tennessee has come to dominate the Smithsonian in its approaches to things. And the most and so for many years, nearly 30 years, Doug Owsley and I have sat on opposite sides of a table, collegially, but with many particular differences. And I'll just mention that the two that will maybe shown here from time to time have to do with adherence on the part of the forensic anthropologists at Tennessee to race, the idea that race is a fundamental natural category and really as a definer of the people in the well, versus the UMass emphasis on culture and history, the political and economic effects on human biology and using human biology to understand, let's say, African Americans as they lived as enslaved and free people, so different than understanding them as essentially Negroids. And then the other thing in which we've differed has to do with the public engagement, so that throughout the 80s, indigenous people around the world, and Native Americans in particular, were focused on the Smithsonian and its 18,000 Native American remains as desecrators of their ancestral remains and of the defilers, in the sense of their dignity. I worked, and let me say this led to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, in which Native Americans won their point of view in 1990 with a bill that first began with a bill pointed directly at the Smithsonian and ultimately led to all federally funded institutions that give Native people the right to determine the disposition of their ancestral remains and sacred objects. So there's an office, a huge office at the Smithsonian now, whose purpose is to return those remains to the culturally affiliated tribes. Doug Owsley has been and continues to be opposed to the idea that descendant groups should have those rights. And let me just mention that I first worked at the Smithsonian when I was 15, worked with the great J. Lawrence Angel, 15 years old, and then wrote the history of the racist founder of anthropology at the Smithsonian and of the National Association, who was at the Smithsonian when I was in graduate school. Came then as a research associate in physical anthropology for 9 years at the Smithsonian to be involved in a number of studies, including what was then in the late 80s, the largest African American population, the First African Baptist Church from Philadelphia, working under Angel and then taking over with Leslie Rankinhill after his death. Leslie and I conducted the first reburial. We drove the truck back to Philadelphia for their reburial at the Eden Cemetery with some early level of public engagement. The Smithsonian shut down all media on it. They were initially interested, but then realized they were standing in opposition to reburial of remains. but we were standing for it. Also there worked with Native American Rights Fund to help them return remains prior to NAGPRA legislation, which went on to become these ideas about public engagements, the right of human beings to be human beings, because what we do is we memorialize our dead. It is important to us. It is a definitive aspect of our species. From the moment we arrived as a species, we've buried our dead. We've memorialized our dead. We're also curious. And we have sciences. And we found in the African burial ground that if we rely on the descendant community to determine what it thinks is important in research or not, that it is possible to have both. But if they choose to bury their dead, it's perfectly their right to do so. That's my point of view, and that is the way in which I differ from Dr. Owsley. But I will say as I go through these, what I think are maybe some details that need to be emphasized or re-emphasized, that most of the descriptive data that they found is what I would have found, and that's important too. They begin the report describing the excavation, and this I think is an important point that has not been emphasized enough in the previous discussion of the last few sessions. The report describes that excavation of the well as rushed and incomplete, as it certainly was. And the archaeologist, Dr. Daniel Moore, who was required by law to preserve cultural resources that encompass the bones and artifacts, he was made to stop his work after the first 1 foot of excavation. He was given by VCU only 2 or 3 days to excavate, after which time he was made to stand outside a wall and watch a backhoe dig the remaining 30 feet of the well and dump those remains into a backfill pit through which he and his colleagues sifted to find the remains. So then there was remaining another 30 feet that was never excavated. And so, I know you'll have a presentation on the African burial ground next week. You'll see that there are quite a few parallels, except that where the African American community was able to stop and the excavation and intervene on what was really a cemetery and a more careful excavation from the beginning. Here, the community had no opportunity to be involved, and the science was deeply undermined because though each fragment may be fairly intact with respect to the amino acids and other things that are needed to do DNA, what remains are the fragments of bones that were dumped in a pile after having been dumped in the well. So, and you'll see some evidence of this. So the actual accuracy of some of what they were able to find has been affected by that. Let me mention also that since the NAGPRA legislation, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, what I think I am seeing is, by some colleagues, including the Smithsonian, mining the cracks in the law. By which I mean those populations that are not covered by the NAGPRA law now become the populations that those colleagues who have been opposed to the law turn to make as part of their collections. And so that has meant African Americans and non-federally recognized Native American tribes remains. So the East Marshall Well became part of its collection and of the Smithsonian's collection. And I think it may help one understand why, I guess it's 18 or 17 years before Dr. Sean Utze went to the Smithsonian and demanded the return of those remains, there was no report. There was no responsible scientific analysis, and I think that should have been the responsibility of any scientist, to the SHPO, which in this case is the Department of Historic Resources in Virginia, that should have required such a report. So we have a series of things that have left a less than stellar situation with regard to these remains. I also should mention that sometimes I think folks forget that the artifacts in the well, and as I'm responding to that part of the report, and I won't speak much to these artifacts, these are artifacts that largely consist of medical instruments, animal remains, and shoes. I think these are probably the three largest categories. This is not these people were illegally excavated from the sacred context in many cases. In some cases, there may have been foul play. That's not at all clear. But I am kind of assuming that most were buried first. But this well is not a sacred context. These artifacts are not burial artifacts. They are artifacts of the dump, and in that sense, and of the medical examination of these remains, or anatomical examination, and from my point of view, represent, again, sort of the history of their desecration. So as Dr. Simmons indicated, they have been able to put together upper bodies and lower bodies, perhaps 19, which suggests that those are the number of originally intact individuals. That's still a little iffy. Well, this laser pointer worked an hour ago. At any rate, at about halfway through these skeletons, you see a series of lumbar vertebrae. There are so few vertebrae that they found it unreasonable, and I would agree, to try to reconstruct the bottom parts with the upper parts, to reassemble those, rearticulate those. You can see how the knee joints fit in some individuals and don't fit in others. The elbows fit for some individuals and not for others. That allows one to put together arms and legs. But the fitting of the arms and legs together takes place at this point on the endowment above at the sacrum, and that those parts are not available or do not clearly indicate the specific attachments of specific individuals. And so we have these separate rearticulated parts. Let me mention that age was estimated by the usual methods of establishing the maturity of each element, and teeth, as you may recognize, erupt at known ages. So paleopathologists and bioarchaeologists compared teeth to charts such as these that show which teeth have erupted at which ages, and in a particular mouth you'll find that the person will be of a particular age range. The epiphyses at the ends of long bones, these are growth centers, fuse at particular ages. You look at which long bone epiphyses have fused and which have not, and you begin to put together the ages, the developmental ages for people. Once a person is completely mature, all of those, there's no longer variability in these maturation indicators. And so from that point on, it's about the degree of wear and tear, the amount of attrition or wear on the teeth, osteoporosis or bone loss. Cranial suture closure is another interesting element or indicator that continues to form in later ages, but then what we have are rougher ages at that point. And there are 35 or so indicators. And as I've already said, as the report has told us, there are not a lot of bones per individual. So the evidence for age is not at all as accurate as it would be if we had whole skeletons or anything close to that. But some indicators, like teeth, will be very clear about the age of an individual within a fairly limited range. And so they're using broad ranges of 0 to 4-year-olds. It's one of those. There are 4 people between 5 and 9 years of age, 4 people between 10 and 14 years of age, and that's the subadults or children, and 44 individuals over 15 years of age. Sex cannot be determined on morphological grounds, although it may be possible genetically, determined in children. But the genetics could be very key here. Sex in adults is determined with the skull at times, and they rely a great deal on the skull. There are 26 skulls, although there's some contradiction, it seems to me, between the 18 individuals who have more than one cranial element and the 26 that they are using as for a variety of assessments. So I think some of those 26 consist of just one bone. Be aware, this is a very limited sample from which they are deriving information. At any rate, if you look at the pubic, the subpubic angle in this case, a male on the right has a very narrow angle, the female on the left. The wide angle, the female has a birth canal. And so this is the pelvis, and what you're seeing is a male without a birth canal, a female with a birth canal, and in fact there's a great range in between. We're always looking at estimates. Similar problems, about 30 or more indicators. In this case, they're using one bone at a time, often getting what they can from that. Ethnic affiliation or ancestral affiliation is loaded with problems. One of the clear problems is the incompleteness of these skeletons. And I've already suggested that there are differences in sort of philosophical understandings of the significance of race or its insignificance. Richard Jantz, a student of Bass, like Owsley, a forensic anthropologist who reports to the police on a regular basis, believes in race quite absolutely. And that is, in a sense, his view of the objective identity of individuals, whereas my folks would be more interested in the social and cultural and historical factors influencing that individual and being told about by their bones. But what I do want to, it's very clear that one can get a sense of how an individual looked in relationship to their society, and that's how we essentially evaluate race. But there is no skin by which to see skin color. There's no fat. there are no muscles. The skeleton gives a very limited view, but there are many measurements used with some degree of accuracy and a good degree of inaccuracy. Here's a measurement in the maxillofrontal measurement, just to show in Native Americans and whites using Bill Bass's methods. The line represents what they consider to be the racial difference, but you'll see there's a little Native American on the left, but a great deal a little Euro-American on the left, but a great deal of Native American overlap with the Euro-American individuals. So even if you take their point of view, one has probability of understanding the ethnic origin or significance of a person, but the errors will be frequent. Let me just mention that in this study, number V16C and V04C, both of whom were assessed, skulls were assessed as European ancestry, have no faces. So this is an assessment of the calvarium sort of the back of the skull without a face, where most of the measurements would be taken if one were to use for those who use measurements to determine race, and there are no measurements. He has simply, as he said, assessed that, the long, rounded skull looks like, someone of European ancestry. So I think that's an example by which I want to say, and there are lots of what I consider to be antiquated ideas about racial methodology, where they're making comparisons and put people together in a way that, based on their measurements, look like they're Zulu Ashanti, which uses these terms. So these are South African Ghanaians, which have no historical, have little historical probability of ever occurring in the combination. Norse American Black, because that's what the measurements find, but it's not who the people are. And I guess that's as close as I can get to emphasizing the problem there. 6 skulls had, so I would say what you have is, on average, what appears to be a population of African descent that may or may not have Europeans included. It wouldn't surprise me historically if there were a few Europeans, but I'm not convinced. It's possible. That's as far as it goes for me. There are 6 skulls with healed fractures consistent of deliberate violence that occurred earlier in their lives. One individual with multiple healed fractures was unable to straighten his arm, but used it actively in work nonetheless. And there were 3 individuals with deliberate perimortem fractures, that is, fractures that occurred at the time of death. There was no healing after the fracture was made. And 1 gunshot victim. So these 4 are probably victims of some sort of assault. Many individuals showed evidence of cut marks and saw marks associated with dissection, autopsy, and amputations. 2 women were uniquely dissected or bisected at the pubic symphysis, which is like between the legs. I don't know what purpose that would have had. Others showed novice surgical skill. They're learning how to cut. And at least 1 expert surgeon's work is shown. We've heard something already from Dr. Simmons about the evidence of infection. There's a great deal, 15 to 25 individuals have enthesopathies, which means that they underwent a great deal of work. They did arduous work with the muscles were attached to those places where the enthesopathies, these spicules of bone, were growing to help support those bones. The body, the skeleton is alive and a living person. It responds to its environment, and once that person is dead, those responses are frozen. And there is also an interesting discussion of platymeria in the, I wish this pointer worked, but in the proximal femora, at this end of these bones are from the African burial ground. I don't have your permission to show bones from the well, and so you've seen nothing from the well. None of these individuals. I think that's something that would require your approval, but just so that you understand how, and you can see the large muscle attachment in the New York African burial ground individual, and this woman indicates a very difficult work, arduous work. But in the well individuals, there is a broadening of the bone at this proximal end that is associated. There's some argument about whether it might have something to do with Indian ancestry, but I think they properly conclude that it has to do with stress. I think it is work stress that begins prior to the age of 5 years. There are a number of individuals, I think 2 or 3, under 5 years of age, or children, I should say, under 15, who have evidence of having begun to do arduous work already. So I think the description of the skeletal remains for purposes of demographic and pathological assessment is quite adequate. In other words, that work has been done already. Right? The description of these pathologies, of the extent to which age and sex can be documented, that work has been done. It's in the report. You know, my thinking is that the analysis of this information, should there be any analysis, you know, that's a choice that, in my view, descendants make. The analysis of, you know, these remains have now been analyzed twice by researchers who have had concern for their interests and not the interests of the skeleton of the individuals who had died or their community. Twice. Here is a point at which, as a community, you can decide that there's, as we did in the African burial ground, and you'll hear more about that later, what kinds of research you are interested in, if any. And is it research related to memorialization, putting individuals back together? Is it other research that you're interested in? But understanding, I think, it is important to that the dignity and memorialization of these remains is also a prime, should be a prime concern. And to the extent that these conflict, that is something that you would assess. So, but if there is an analysis, I think this information would benefit from a biocultural perspective by bioarchaeologists, historians, and others who are aware of the detailed social historical context to which these discarded people are related. In the New York African Burial Ground Project, and again, these are from the African Burial Ground, the community stopped the GSA, who, like VCU, wished to expedite its building project and establish the authority of descendants to determine respectful treatment of the cemetery and the remains already excavated. Like the East Marshall Well, the remains were once carefully buried as a testament to their humanity in a time when whites rejected their human qualities and rights. Grave robbing in 1788 led to riots in New York. Here it went on into the period of Jim Crow. In the 1990s, Richmond remains were taken by scientists to do with them as they wished. In New York, parallels with the past for those in New York, parallels with the past for those forensic anthropologists who wished to do the same were not overlooked. In New York, the community determined whether there would be research or not, and if so, what its guiding questions would be. Questions that serve the interests of descendants and not the curiosity of the Janses or the Owsleys or the Blakeys. And that community required the restoration of its ancestral remains to sacred space, you know, as can be expected of all human beings. And they brought about a U.S. national monument that you see here. These are your questions. Thank you.
Okay, the table's been set. Here's your task. So there's actually two parts to this question, and I only see one part, but I'll tell you what the second part is so you don't lose time. How does your understanding of the research findings presented today inform whether other research should be done? And if so, what is the research you would like to see done? Those are the two questions. So I want to spend some time now in helping you to understand an important component of the project and the process that you've been engaged in thus far to get us to this point in the design of the project. And as I stated earlier, in our objectives for today's consultation, this process has been designed, and it's been designed to collect input that will inform the future steps, the future memorialization, study, reburial, all of those ingredients for the human remains that came out of the well. So I want to introduce a little bit of a diagram that will help you understand where we've come from and also where we're going so that you can contextualize this project a little bit more. So essentially, in 1994, the remains were found, and in 2000, there were studies that were conducted, and you've heard some about those studies. But you can find out a lot more because you can access the studies in writing, the published studies on the website, on the project's website. So that gets us to March 2015. Then that should be March 2000, those dates are wrong. Yeah. So VCU created a planning committee in 2013. And that planning committee was charged with implementing a process that would make it possible for there to be deliberation and consideration informed by these presentations that that have occurred up until this point. And so where we are is in that process. We've had 3 out of 4 consultations. There will be a 5th consultation, and that's what's represented in this 3rd box. And it refers to something called public guidance on the formation of the FRC, which is shorthand for the Family Representative Council. That's a name that we came up with as a way to describe their task. So I want to take you to the next slide so that you understand that there is going to come a point where this Family Representative Council will take all of the input and receive all of the input, and they are going to have a task. And Dr. Allison is going to come up and talk about that task because it's going to happen parallel with the work of the planning committee. There's going to be this Family Representative Council that has also got a task. They're operating in parallel. And then at the end of this process, there will be a point at which that Family Representative Council is going to make recommendations to leadership at VCU about what should happen next around further study, further input on memorialization, further input on anything that has to do with the physical reburial. So I wanted you to understand that process because this task that we have, the task that we have done thus far, were to make it possible to also launch the Family Representative Council. Again, the dates at the top are a little off, but the process is what I want you to pay attention to. And now I'd like for Dr. Allison to talk about the Family Representative Council and the roles that we have envisioned.
So when we think about this Family Representative Councils, today's presentations have really talked about the human remains and that disconnect of the remains, the individuals who were discovered, and their families. And so when we're in that situation, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources really supports putting in place this process to identify individuals who will sit really as family to really take on the responsibility of making recommendations around three things: the need for study, reburial, and memorialization. So those will be the things that we will be asking this Family Representative Council to take on. So the council will serve as that family group. It will make those recommendations, and those will be the ones that in the diagram that you saw will be coming back to us to then transition to implementation. So when we think about the work of that council, we anticipate, if I can have the next slide, that the work of that council over this ensuing period, over the summer, we're thinking that it's going to last through the fall of 15. That group will participate in a number of meetings. We anticipate those would be held possibly in the evening. We will provide support to that group. The studies are available, as you know, but just as we've had the educational presentations in each of the meetings, we will work to support that group with any additional information, resources, opportunities to learn that will help them in doing their work. So we'll continue to support the Family Representative Council in learning around struggling with those questions that have been posed. What kind of additional study? How do we continue to build on the presentations from today to think about those kinds of questions and deciding if there are any additional ones that the Family Representative Council would recommend. So any additional learning, we anticipate that part of that would also be a trip up to the Smithsonian to meet with Doug Owsley and others relative to the work that has been done there. And we anticipate then that those recommendations would come back to us, hopefully sometime around September or in the early fall. So that's kind of with Don's background around the overall process, what we anticipate that the work and responsibilities of the Family Representative Council will be. So with that, we're going to then transition to really get your input in our work and thinking about forming that body, because that's part of our transition at this point. How do we identify those individuals who will sit on and really serve as those family representatives? So I'll turn it back over to Don.
Okay, so I hope that helps you to understand the process. So actually, Tavares, if we can go back to the diagram, this one. This idea is really about now putting in place two pieces. The Planning Committee is going to continue its work to make sure that this opportunity, this project, provides opportunity for meeting the smell test, if you will, of whether there was sufficient opportunity for input, guidance to be given. And that guidance is now going to be put in the hands of the FRC, this Family Representative Council. The Planning Committee will continue to work to ensure that the project overall continues to move forward. The role of this Family Representative Council, which Dr. Allison talked about, is to really now, if you will, create family, create the role of family members who can then further deliberate and move from the bigger consultation to now really taking responsibility for implementing a set of steps to communicate to VCU some guidance that it can then respond to, address, engage with further. The part that I want you to understand is this role of this Family Representative Council is very obviously critical to linking what these consultations have done to actually then translate them and communicate them, but also be held accountable for what is the engagement that goes forward to move from these big consultations to a smaller group of people who are actually responsible. So one of the things that I hope you understood is that we see a smaller group of people who will take some ownership, and the level of responsibility that we're going to be asking your guidance on is in the next task. What we're basically wanting to do is figure out what you think are the characteristics, qualities, elements of being on this council. What kind of people are we looking for? So that this very important task can be taken up in as productive and successful a way as possible. So that's where I'm going to leave it. But now we're going to go back before we talk about that next task and report on some of what you gave us in the way of your discussions. And this is what we got from your scribes. And I'll just walk you through it. This is not everything, but it's some of what we got. And before you leave today, there will be a preliminary report that you're given, a hard copy that contains some of this information so that you can walk away. And I don't know that you should be able to get all 3 of the preliminary reports from our website. But today you walk away with the preliminary report from what you talked about today. And the reason to do that is so that you can go out and engage other people, bring them into this process. But to do that, we figure you would be helped by having a sheet of paper. So some of what you talked about today came under the category of research. Socioeconomic, what was life like for individuals during that time? So we actually have some information about that. That was one of the subjects of a previous consultation. Genetic. Is it possible to have additional modern study conducted? Are there any other options other than DNA testing? We'd like to have more. We'd like more information, I'm going to assume, about the process to connect families to the remains. And what would the swabbing process look like? All great questions, all great points. These comments have to do with different kinds of feelings, emotions, and issues around memorialization. Ensure humanity is restored to the individuals. Would like to see an amphitheater. Would like individual memorialization, not mass graves. What laws or statutes are in place to prevent this from happening again? Connect to Baltimore and other present-day issues. All right, is there more? Okay. This gives you a taste of what has been going on in the room. You've been listening at your table, but we wanted to give you a sense of what's come out from all the tables. So this is now going to be added to all of the input we've gotten in the previous 2 consultations. And now we want you to really focus on this Family Representative Council and the task of helping to give us guidance so that the planning committee can convene this Family Representative Council. And once we get your guidance, then we're going to basically ask people to step up to that role, to say that they, now understanding what the work is, they would like to be considered to be on that council. So that's what I'm wanting you to understand. So one of the things that we want you to do at your tables is talk amongst yourselves about what are the elements, the characteristics, the kinds of qualities that members of this council should have. And that's going to be your final task for the day. What characteristics would you like the members of the Family Representative Council to demonstrate? We're going to give you about 35 minutes for that discussion, and then we'll come back. Thank you. So as you know, the information that you've been discussing has been sent by the scribes to our ideas table, and they've been compiling it, and they're still compiling it. So one of the things we're going to do now is repeat a process we've done to make sure that they have enough time, but also to make sure that this, again, within the framework of informing and educating people, we like to have a little bit of fun, and it's been fun. So we've got a couple of questions about Richmond's African American history that we want to ask you to deliberate on at your tables. And there's no prize other than bragging rights, but we do want to make sure that you have a chance to learn some things that you might need to learn and make sure somebody else learns them too. So I've got a couple of questions, and I'll read them first, and then we'll give you a chance to talk about it at the table, and then we'll come back and see if you got the answers. So, question number one. This political organization registered Richmond voters and made black votes count, even while the poll tax and the Byrd organization remained illegal and in power. Question number two. This Richmond native was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1987, although his greatest seasons were played in the Negro Leagues, and he never got the chance to play in the major leagues. So these are two questions that if you've been a student of African American history, or you're from a certain generation perhaps, you will know, but we were running into the problem where the questions were too easy before. So we have stepped the questions up a little bit. So you've got some few minutes I'll give you to discuss this amongst yourselves, and then we're going to see who knows their African American history. Thank you. I only see one table that feels confident. Is there no low confidence out here, yeah? Okay, let's see. This political organization registered Richmond voters and made black votes count, even while the poll tax and the Byrd organization remained legal and in power. What was the name of that organization? That's right. Is anybody in the room who was involved in that work? Okay. All right. This Richmond native was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1987, although his greatest seasons were played in the Negro Leagues, and he never got a chance to play in the major leagues. Who was that? Raymond Dandridge. Well, Yeah, we were going to put the answer, but did you guys know the answer before we put it up there? All right, okay. So who in the room actually saw, I don't know, maybe that's possible. Is there anyone in the room who actually saw a Negro League baseball game? Yeah, I think. Yeah, no, but a game. I think that's probably, that would be a little bit further out. Okay, well, it's important that we see this work in the context of history, yeah? Because we're basically bridging history from the 19th century to 1994, and from 1994 till today, and then we have to take it into the future. And so before we report on some of the information, and so again, it's only some of it, that we received from your discussions. One question that was raised, and it was important enough that I thought I should speak to it a little bit. The members of this family representative council, just like family, you have all kinds of people in family, right? You know, not that this is a pretty sober responsibility, but when our family members have made their transition, you know, there are conversations that take place and different voices are heard, but it's not restricted to the people who may have any particular educational preparation or specialty. You know, it's family. It's for everybody who's got some standing and has a contribution to make and wants to participate. So I wanted to make sure that there was no expectation that there was some threshold that you had to meet in terms of your educational preparation or, you know, special knowledge. In some ways, what we're doing here is trying to by proxy make sure that these remains and the people behind the remains, whose remains they are not lost to history. And so this idea is, I think that the biggest qualification is that you care. Okay? But let's see what you said. Okay, process and authority. What power does this group have? Who makes final decisions regarding recommendations? First session should be an open session so folks can volunteer to participate. Will this group hold VCU accountable? These are all exactly the kinds of questions that are the kinds of input we would expect. So thank you. Group dynamics. Serious and honest commitment, should be problem solvers, should have good group skills. True, all true. Others? So let me say a couple of words about that. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of VCU because the idea is that today we'll take this, but there is a fourth consultation and a fifth consultation. The way we've thought about it so far is that the fourth consultation is going to focus more on what has been done in similar or somewhat comparable projects in other places, like the African Burial Ground in New York. But there are a few other examples, so you get into the memorialization, the reburial, those kinds of questions. And you've given some input about that already. We want more, but in order to do that, we're going to, in the fourth consultation, so in the fourth consultation, we want to make sure that we set a table of information and education to talk about what some things you should think about are. The fifth consultation will be where we bring everything together, all the information, all the views, the guidance, perspectives that we've gotten from all four consultations. We will, by that time, also have developed some guidance and launched a process for convening and seating this representative council. We will have some recommendations about ground rules, authority, standing, decision-making. And that will be what we present at the 5th consultation, and that will be an opportunity, and at least the opportunity in this process, to finally shape those elements as we then hand that over, those responsibilities over to the Family Representative Council in anticipation of them working further and engaging later in the fall with people leadership at Virginia Commonwealth. So that's a general explanation of how we see the process going into the next phases, the next final steps. And we hope that you and the folks that you bring forward will participate in that. In Consultation 4, focusing on memorialization, reburial, further study, those kinds of issues. And then in the 5th consultation, we really want to test and confirm some of the things that we've heard and are going to feed back in the way of potential things to consider. And then in that 5th consultation, to tweak it and finalize it so that the Family Representative Council can proceed with its work. And so you hopefully look to hear more about that and look for opportunities to recommend yourselves and others to be a part of that Family Representative Council. Okay, so now we're winding down, so I want to bring you to the final pieces of work we'd like for you to do. You should have received in your packet an evaluation form. That's this form right here. It's yellow. We'd like you to fill that out now. Leave it at your table with your facilitators. You also should have a pre-registration form for the next 2 consultations. We have the date for the 4th consultation, that's May 30th, here, same time, same place. And we will very soon decide when the 5th consultation will be, but it will be probably, I would say in July, no later than July. We'd like for you to fill this out and leave this here. And for the folks who have served as facilitators and scribes and greeters and in many of the other roles, especially to help us make this a useful process, if you'd like to do that and you'd like to volunteer, please fill this form out. If you'd like to volunteer someone else to do that work, or you want to invite others into the process, we'd like that as well. And in fact, let's give a hand to the facilitators and scribes who I think deserve a lot of credit for making sure that this is a process that's deliberative and effective. So one of the things that we've tried to do, and I'm going to ask Dr. Allison to come back up to make final comments. We've always ended, or not always, but we have now, I think this will be our 3rd consultation where we have, 2nd consultation where we've ended with a cultural presentation. And we did that, we made the decision to do that because we wanted to leave and put the wrap up with this not entirely framed out as an intellectual exercise, but to really frame it again as something that has to do with culture and real people and real lives. We don't know as much as we'd like to know about those lives, but they were lives lived. And we want, as often as possible, to bring that to the forefront. And so I will just mention and give thanks for the presentation that we'll receive. It'll be done by Mr. James Russell Bennett III. And it's going to be, I think he's presenting a song called Crossing the Jordan. So after Dr. Allison is finished, please stick around and give James Russell Bennett III your kind attention. So just for myself, thank you very much for your participation this morning, and I hope to see you at consultation number 4 and consultation number 5. Thanks a lot.
I just want to echo Don's thanks to you all for turning out this Saturday. Appreciate you all being here today and for your prior participation. We do hope you will be able to join us on the 30th for our 4th consultation. Again, want to echo our thanks and appreciation to the scribes and facilitators for your work. And finally, want to thank both JSA for their exceptional design relative to our community facilitation process, and to the members of our planning committee who have really done yeoman's work in terms of bringing us to this point in our process. So if we could just thank all of those folks again with a little round of applause. And now we'll have Mr. Bennett to close us out.
This part of today's program will take us back to a very painful part of our past, slavery. We begin in the spring of 1790 in Richmond, Virginia, down at the auction block located near Lumpkin Jail in Shockoe Bottom, where slaves were sold and traded like animals. Jim is 64 years old, and he has just been sold for the 7th time since his birth to a new master. At this age, he is still valuable to a plantation owner because of his carpentry skills and building slave quarters, and he can still make babies. Let's listen as Jim speaks.
I've been so again to a new master. God, out of time, and out of home. I've been from the journey, so I can be free. Cause from the journey, I won't be sold no more. Cause from the journey, I won't be rich no more. Cause from the journey, I won't see my children taken away from me. I won't see my master sleeping with my wife and my daughter. Cause from the journey, I've been ready changed. I've been free.
That was the wish of many slaves, to die and cross the Jordan to be free. Now, Jim sings a song that reflects those desires.